M. Night, are you sure you only produced this? What is up, everybody, and welcome to my somewhat delayed, I would probably just go out and say late review of The Watchers. This is a new horror thriller that came out last weekend. I had planned on watching this in a double feature with Bad Boys Ride or Die, but I just got way too tired that night. I didn't want to be unfair to the second movie, which was going to be The Watchers, so I decided to just go home, and then it was a busy weekend. So this is the first time I've actually been able to go out and check this thing out, and unfortunately, the last weekend, the reception, the buzz, the early word of this film was not so great. So I was actually walking in hoping that maybe me having lowered expectations would allow me to like this movie more than seemingly most other people have. But the interesting thing about The Watchers is that this is actually directed by M. Night Shyamalan's daughter, Ishana. So this is her directorial debut. And basically what this film is about is that you have Dakota Fanning, who is this woman that works for this pet store. She's delivering this like rare bird, I guess, that has been ordered, and she ends up getting lost in the woods, and in true Shyamalan fashion, she's stuck in this supernatural situation that is very intriguing, where the woods now are full encompassing around her, there's seemingly no escape, and she comes across a group of people that are bunkered down in this small little building that essentially tells her, if you go out at night, you're gonna get killed. You have to stand in front of this two-way mirror, and these creatures are going to watch you. They're going to look at you, they're going to study you, and as long as you follow their rules and don't go out at night, you'll survive, but your ass is stuck here with us. Very intriguing setup. You know, this is right out of M. Night Shyamalan's playbook. It doesn't matter how great, how terrible, or how mediocre his movies are sometimes. The setup, the premise, the inciting incident is always fascinating. It always draws me in. So does Ishana as a director show the strength and the promise of her father's films? Does it show the weaknesses and the frustrations of her father's films? Or is it actually really unique and she carves her own path completely? Let's get into it. So starting off with the positives, at the risk of repeating myself, that concept, that inciting incident, that premise of this film is very interesting. Putting a fish out of water situation where a woman is brought into these very creepy woods and is surrounded by people that are telling her in full confidence that there's this really weird, monstrous, supernatural situation going on, and you, as well as the main character, are asking so many questions about how this works, how they know that, how much of it is true, and the entire runtime of the film is you trying to answer those questions, and it's an interesting ride to go on. I also like how this movie ends up being a bit of a genre blender. You do have some of that horror thriller edge in there, and as it goes on, you get a little bit more of a fantasy edge. There's also some Irish folklore brought into there, so it is a movie that is rich with ideas, and it is trying to do a lot of different things and intertwine them all together, which is commendable. I think the creature design is pretty interesting. You get to see a little bit more of it as it goes on. You get to see a little bit more revealed as the film goes on. A lot of it is revealed in shadows or in obscured visuals, which certainly helps not only lower budget, but also helps with building the intrigue and kind of making you map out a lot more details in your mind. I also thought some of the sound design was pretty good, namely with the creatures. You know, most of what you were experiencing this situation through in the first half of the film is just the sound design. It's just the scratches and the roars and the noises outside of this bunker that they call the coop. And so just like with the obscured images, you're able to paint a very vivid picture in your head without the movie hand-holding you through what exactly is going on outside of those doors. And finally, I do think that the movie is shot very well. I think that the way that they frame and use cinematography in regards to this coop, as well as with the woods, which can be a very repetitive setting, but they find different ways to kind of shoot different areas of it and different openings, and you know, certain spots where they'll walk and they'll get a little opening in the trees, and all it does is show how vast and how seemingly endless the woods are, which very much evokes that contradictory feeling that you get having endless opportunity of places to go, to escape, to explore, and yet that makes it feel all the more isolated. And from what what I understand, a lot of this was shot on location on Ireland, so this does very much have a folklore kind of edge to it as they start to get into that side of the movie, because all of the locations that they're showing are legit. Moving on to the mixed aspect, one of the things that I was interested in checking this out for was to see what Ishana could do, to see what she could bring to the table. Nepotism is a giant topic of debate nowadays. Not that it wasn't previously, but nowadays especially, with actors bringing their children into Hollywood, with directors bringing their children in and creating that question of, do these people actually deserve this? Are they actually of the talent that deserves these opportunities, or is it just a matter of their parents gave them the shortcut that they don't fully earn? And there's plenty of examples of people that absolutely buck that and show you that they are massively talented and who gives a shit who their parents are. And there's a number of examples like, Kanye and Kim's kid that shows you that money is more powerful than talent sometimes. And this movie gave me a very complicated feeling in regards to the promise, I guess, the potential of Ishana Shyamalan. On one hand, she seems like a very capable director right out of the gate, especially with the cinematography and the shot choice and going to location and, forming these concepts and the way that she's trying to adapt a book to the screen. Like, I do see potential there. On the other side of it, I feel extremely hesitant about her following so closely in her father's footsteps, to where if you didn't know any better, you would swear this is an M. Night Shyamalan film. And I probably would assume that most people checking this out that don't really pay attention to the credits are going to walk away thinking exactly that when they see the name Shyamalan. They're going to be like, oh, they fucked up his name. They misspelled it. That's weird. But this is almost identical to the types of movies that he has always made his entire career. It's the same types of concepts, it's the same pacing, it's the same kind of plot structure with how you start to get certain things and the utilizations of plot twists in the third act. And this is not a great movie. I haven't gotten into my negatives yet, but I have more issues than I have things that I loved about this one, unfortunately. And a lot of the issues that I have with it are, again, very reminiscent of a lot of M. Night Shyamalan's very commonly recurring issues in his lesser films. So it kind of gives me a little bit of pause on whether or not he actually was a producer or he was very hands-on during the making of this film. And it's because of that I really hope that she goes off and starts to do movies that are very different than her father, or she's always going to have that comparison. We're going to walk into her films with the same expectations that we have with her father's films, which in a lot of ways are his downfall more times than not. You're going to walk in knowing there's a plot twist, and just by knowing the concept of the movie or watching the trailer, you're automatically got about 6 or 7 different ideas of what the twist is going to be. And so I just think that she's going to be much better off as a promising new director, a new filmmaker, a new storyteller, if, she starts to do different things. Go off and do a different genre than your father typically does, try a different plot structure, try to do something that doesn't feel so reminiscent of what he does. And now moving on to the negatives. And first of all, I think this movie's concept was interesting, but it really started to lose steam by the end of the first act. I think all of the initial setup and the initial buildup was really intriguing and, started to build a slight bit of tension, but the more the movie went on, it was very slow paced. There wasn't enough explanation going on early on, and the amount of explanation we got later on ended up being too much, which I'll get into. And it just ended up being a film that the longer that the runtime went on, the less interested and less invested I was in this story. One of the main reasons why I had lost a lot of interest as it went on is that every single character in this movie is pretty dull. They're not really that well explored. They're not really that deep of characters. Even the performances themselves, which I don't know if I can attribute fully to the writing or to a very amateur director in Ishana Shyamalan, and maybe her directing the performances out of her actors is kind of her weakness so far that she has to work on. But you got somebody like Dakota Fanning here who has been awesome all the way back when she was a child, and her performance and her character is just very monotone, just very emotionless, and not in a direct, deliberate way where her character is broken from the past, even though there is a bit of that with her story. It just feels like dead on arrival. Her responses to this larger than life situation and to these very scary situations and to, the different reveals that come along, there's just no oomph behind it. There's no emotional response that really gets us to invest ourselves in the character or the reveals that go on. So it just, the whole cast, which you're stuck with the entire film, a very limited cast in a very small location, are just kind of dull. And going off of Dakota Fanning's character a bit, there's something that this movie does that is a very tricky thing to balance. And it's a fairly common thing that they try to do with main characters in a horror and thriller situation where there's a past event or a past trauma that kind of defines this character, and inevitably this new supernatural situation they find themselves in very much mirrors externally what is going on with the character internally. So without getting into too much, she essentially has this guilt in her past where she doesn't really have a very good outlook of herself. And so she's stuck in this situation where she's in literally facing a mirror most of the film. She is facing a two-way mirror where she's looking at her own reflection and something else is viewing her and judging her. And so while that can work sometimes, while that can be a very poetic synergy there, when you have the right backstory and the right character motivations matched up with the right external storyline, in this case, it felt too on the nose to me. It felt too deliberate. It felt too spelled out. This movie also falls victim to trying to explain too much, which is another thing that is very difficult to balance with a film like this. Sometimes you have a movie that builds very intriguing and supernatural and otherworldly ideas that deliberately explains almost nothing, and that is its own version of frustration where we don't really get to know enough and it's all ambiguity, it's all something you're supposed to just put all the pieces together yourselves, which can be fun and can be frustrating, and sometimes it just doesn't work. You also have the opposite end of the spectrum where they explain too much, and the more they explain, the less sense things start to make, and you start calling in logic issues, and the answers that they give are not very interesting or satisfying, or are less satisfying than the ones that we've been building in our head through the entire runtime. And this very much falls into that camp where the entire last half of this film, you get explanations of what is going on outside of this room, what the Watchers actually are. You start to get explanations of how people ended up in this coop building, how the coop building was built, some origins regarding the man that built it, and how these people ended up there in their own individual little storylines, as well as how they're supposed to escape or how they can escape. And so inevitably the third act of this film feels entirely bogged down with giving explanations and having to try to make sense of things very quickly to move on to the next thing that we have to explain. At the same time, it also really stretches your suspension of disbelief to a point where it's too much. At least for me, it was too much. Now, that pretty much wraps up all of my spoiler-free thoughts. I'm still going to try my best to maintain a mostly spoiler-free explanation of this last piece of my negatives, but I'm going to have to get into a little bit more detail to fully evoke why it didn't work for me. So, going along with what I just said about the explanations of suspension of disbelief, there's a lot of shit in this movie that just makes absolutely zero fucking sense whatsoever. Which again, is a thing that's hard to balance. Sometimes you have to stick to some bullshit to make your movie plot work, and as long as you don't draw too much attention to it, most people can get through it just fine. And then sometimes if you inevitably have to draw a lot of attention to it through explaining so much, those of us that get hung up on logic more than others are going to start to question a lot of things that we didn't question in the first half of the film. The big one is just Dakota Fanning's character makes no sense to me. First of all, she gets lost in the edge of the woods, like her car breaks down in this little road. So she picks up this bird cage, walks about 30 feet deep into the woods and starts yelling for help. Anybody! Somebody! I'm stuck in the fucking woods! Come and help me! Somebody!
Hello? I need some help.
Who the fuck do you think is just hanging out in the woods to help you? What are you doing? Then she comes across this group of people And they are immediately like, you hear the creature sounds in the woods, the night is falling through the woods, things are getting really intense, and they're like, please, bitch, get inside, you're gonna die. Get into this creepy ass bunker that we live in. There's monsters out in the woods that are gonna eviscerate you if you stay outside. Now we're gonna close the door, and this big ass mirror that you see here, it's actually a two-way window. You have to look outside, stand straight, don't blink, don't move. We do this every single night. Just trust us. This is what you have to do to survive here. And at no point does she go, what? Like, they just laid a lot of fucked up information on her in seconds. And at no point over the next 5 to 10 minutes of her processing all of this does she ever say, yeah, I'm gonna need more. I'm gonna need a little bit more explanation and context for all this bullshit you just laid on me, or I'm fucking out of here. Like, this is weird. Then eventually, the older woman here, who's kind of like the elder, the one that knows everything, lays out the rules. You can't go out at night, and you can't, go past certain places in the woods. And if you find the little holes that they crawl out of, you can't mess with the holes. And there's like 5 or 6 different rules. And at no point does she ask, okay, who the fuck told you the rules? These things don't communicate apparently, so what the fuck? Do you speak Watcher? Explain. Then we get to a point in the film where they start to get a lot of this backstory exposition about how the Watchers were discovered out in these woods and what person initially came out to study them and how the fuck they got this immaculate concrete bulletproof glass bunker to look at them through and how he got back and forth to the bunker. And every explanation they give about how the construction was actually undergone while navigating these monsters and nightfall and everything, you're like, get the fuck out of here. There's even a point where they give a line of dialogue that very directly suggests that electronic devices only work inside of the coop. They do not work outside of the coop, which gives you a supernatural explanation, like there's some kind of a curse or there's some kind of a weird cabin in the woods effect outside of this coop that prevents telephone signals and 5G and internet and just basic electronic functions. That is the explanation that we are given. So again, you ask yourself, how the fuck was this thing built if you couldn't use anything inside of the woods in the first place? And just because you successfully somehow figured out how to build this building in the middle of these cursed ass woods, why does that suddenly make everything within these 4 walls not susceptible to the curse or whatever the fuck is going on? Oh, and they discover this backstory exposition, by the way, because somebody accidentally kicks a rug out of the way inside of this very small coop that some of these characters actually tell you have been living there for the better part of a year, if not longer. And there's a hatch underneath the fucking rug. You've been living in this like room-sized house with 4 other people for a fucking year, and none of you thought to move the goddamn rug? None of you accidentally moved the rug in a year? Even just other little things with that bit of information. I've been in here for 8 months, and somebody else probably even longer. Like, really? You've been surviving out here for 8 months on crows, and you don't look emaciated whatsoever. You got no stubble growing. Your clothes look perfectly washed. I don't see a fucking washing machine in this little bunker. As we get into nitpicks at this point, perhaps. But again, the more that you start to question things, the more the little things that you're supposed to immediately accept and never really think on start to get called into question. And once you start doing all that, ooh, the hits just keep coming. There's things like that throughout the entire movie that you kind of draw a little bit of, an eyebrow raise when you first see them, but especially in the last 40 minutes of the film, when you start to get all these explanations back to back to back, it just makes you question everything that came before even more so. So it is a movie that crumbles under its own logic, and the longer you think about it, the longer you analyze the information that they have given you and expect you to just digest and go along with, the more holes you inevitably poke through it, and it just falls apart. So all in all, guys, the movie was okay. It falls just short of me being able to give you a confident recommend. So it's not a totally successful directorial debut in my mind. There's some interesting ideas going on here. It does show some early promise, but it just crumbles under its own explanations and own logic, and it's a movie that it just was a bit boring to get through, unfortunately. So if you're really fascinated to see what this woman can do, maybe check it out later on after it comes to streaming. But I really just hope that she moves on from these concepts and types of films that really feel like her dad was doing much more than producing. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all of my 2024 new release reviews. I'm also going to put my ranking of M. Night Shyamalan's films. This came out after Old, I believe. Like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.